My name is Sarah Chen, I'm 28 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, my family thought I was just another failed nanny living off their charity. What they didn't know is that I had just been promoted to regional vice president of the largest educational technology company on the West Coast. Yes, you heard that right, that Asian American girl they always treated as the weird adopted daughter now managed a $50 million budget and supervised 15 offices across 6 states. But of course, to the Hartwells, my adoptive family from Connecticut, I was still the little girl they saved from a San Francisco orphanage when I was 7 years old. To them, my greatest accomplishment in life should have been eternal gratitude for having the luck to grow up in their $4 million colonial mansion in Greenwich. For 20 years, I believed that narrative. I fought desperately to prove I deserved to be there, that I was more than just a successful charity project. I graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, got my MBA from Wharton, built a career that would make any parent proud, but it was never enough for Margaret Hartwell, my adoptive mother. To her, I would always be the Chinese girl that they had the kindness to take in, as if it were a favor I should spend the rest of my life repaying. What hurt me most wasn't the lack of recognition for my professional achievements, it was how Margaret systematically erased my cultural identity. When I was a child and tried to talk about my Chinese heritage, she would say it didn't matter anymore, because now I was a Hartwell. When I wanted to learn Mandarin at 15, she enrolled me in French classes, saying it would be more refined for a young lady of our social position. When I brought Asian American boyfriends home during college, she always found subtle flaws: he seems too ambitious, or he doesn't have the proper education for our family. But when my adoptive sister Jessica brought any of her white boyfriends home, even the ones who clearly just wanted access to the family bank account, Margaret received them like enchanted princes. It was a silent and constant war for my own identity, fought at the mahogany dinner table, in hallways lined with family portraits where my face always seemed out of place, and at every family gathering where I felt like an eternal visitor in my own home. The painful irony was that while Margaret preached about unconditional love and its family values to her charity friends, she was systematically conditioning my love and acceptance on complete cultural assimilation and perfect performance. According to her narrow definition of success, everything was about to change at the annual Hartwell reunion in Martha's Vineyard. I had been keeping a secret for 6 months, a sealed envelope that arrived at my Palo Alto apartment, sent by a lawyer from San Francisco. Inside was a birth certificate I had never seen, with names I didn't recognize, and a handwritten letter from a woman named Li Wei-Chin. The letter was in English, but filled with Chinese characters in the margins, as if she wanted to teach me our language through her words. She said she was my grandmother, not just biologically, but the matriarch of a family that had never stopped looking for me. Li Wei-Chen was the founder of one of the largest import companies on the West Coast, a woman who had built an empire starting from scratch when she arrived from China in the 1960s. And she was alive. At 89 years old, she was alive and wanted to meet me. The letter explained that my biological parents had died in a car accident when I was 6, and that the family had fought in courts for 2 years to find me before I was placed for adoption. They never stopped searching. For 20 years. While I was begging for crumbs of approval from the Hartwells, an entire family had been searching for me, building businesses, creating legacies, and keeping my place at their table warm and waiting. How many times have you wondered if you really belong where you grew up? How many times have you felt like you're living the life others chose for you, instead of the life you would have created for yourself? If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own family, like you're constantly trying to prove your worth to people who should love you unconditionally, then you'll understand exactly what happened when my phone rang that fateful afternoon in Martha's Vineyard. Because sometimes, life has a peculiar way of revealing who we really are at the moment we least expect it, and who our families really are when they think no one is paying attention. This is the story of how I discovered that for 20 years, I was begging for love and recognition from the wrong people, while an entire family was waiting for me on the other side of the country. And it's the story of how a simple phone call transformed the girl, adopted out of charity, into the woman her own as saviors would end up begging to hire them. Sometimes the people who claim to have rescued you are actually the ones you need to be rescued from, and sometimes the family you're desperately trying to prove yourself worthy of is just a pale imitation of the family that's been proving themselves worthy of you all along. The Hartwells were what you'd call Connecticut old money, the kind of family that appeared in the society pages of the Greenwich Time and donated generously to the Metropolitan Opera and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. From the outside, they were the perfect American family. Margaret Hartwell served on the boards of 3 charitable organizations. Richard Hartwell was a senior partner at a corporate law firm in Manhattan, and they had raised 4 successful children in their 1847 colonial mansion. At charity galas, Margaret loved to tell the story of how they saved 2 orphan girls, Jessica and me, who was adopted 2 years after me from a Puerto Rican family in the Bronx. It was her favorite story of personal philanthropy, always told with tears in her eyes and applause from the audience. But inside, the Hartwell mansion operated like a cruel corporate hierarchy, where love was directly tied to conformity and usefulness. Margaret ruled the house with an iron fist, disguised in kid gloves, and her approval was rare currency that she distributed only to those who followed her perfect life script. Richard, 20 years older than Margaret and clearly exhausted from decades of marriage, had become a passive observer who chose his battles carefully. He rarely confronted Margaret about anything, preferring to hide behind his Wall Street Journal and single malt whiskeys after dinner. The house itself felt like a museum of WASP perfection, everything perfectly preserved, nothing out of place, and an unspoken understanding that we were all just caretakers of an image that was more important than any individual happiness. Margaret Hartwell was a 58-year-old woman who looked like she had stepped directly out of a Ralph Lauren catalog, perfectly waved blonde hair, always impeccable nails, and a wardrobe that cost more than most people earn in a year. She had grown up in a Boston high society family and viewed adoptive motherhood as an extension of her philanthropic work, not as an act of unconditional love. To Margaret, children were projects that needed to be molded, polished, and presented to society as reflections of her own moral superiority. She had a frightening ability to make devastating comments with a sweet smile, always wrapped in immaternal concern. Her compliments came with conditions, her displays of affection were performative, and her disappointment was a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. Margaret didn't see people, she saw potential for social status, and any deviation from her expectations was treated as a personal betrayal. Her obsession with appearances and cultural conformity was so deep that she had spent years trying to erase any trace of our ethnic origins, as if our heritage were an inconvenient stain on her perfect family narrative. To her, Jessica and I should be grateful for having been elevated from our inferior origins and spend the rest of our lives proving we deserved that elevation. She had this particular way of smiling when delivering crushing criticism. A practiced expression that said, "I'm doing this because I love you," while systematically destroying your confidence. Margaret's love was transactional, her acceptance was conditional, and her idea of family was more like an exclusive country club where membership could be revoked at any moment for failing to meet impossible standards. The other family members functioned like satellites orbiting around the sun. That was Margaret. Richard Jr., the eldest biological son at 32, was the apparent heir to the law firm, a man who had inherited all of Margaret's arrogance without any of her strategic intelligence. He treated me like an eternal intern, always explaining obvious things and making subtle jokes about family diversity. At family dinners, he had this condescending way of asking about my computer work as if I were fixing printers instead of managing multi-million-dollar technology initiatives. Caroline, 30, was the biological daughter who had become a carbon copy of Margaret, married to an investment banker and living in a Westchester mansion with 2 children she outsourced to nannies while organizing charity events. She was sweet to me in front of Margaret, but cold and distant when we were alone, as if acknowledging our sisterhood might somehow diminish her status as the real daughter. Jessica, my 26-year-old adopted sister, had become the family rebel, an artist living in Brooklyn who refused to attend most family events and maintained a tense but honest relationship with me. She was the only one who occasionally called attention to the differential treatment we received, but her confrontations with Margaret always ended in dramatic explosions that left everyone exhausted. Thomas, the youngest biological son at 24, still lived at home after graduating from an expensive college where he spent 4 years partying, and had an impressive ability to be completely oblivious to family tensions, treating everyone with superficial cordiality that sometimes made me feel invisible. My childhood was punctuated by moments that perfectly crystallized the family's toxic dynamics. At 10 years old, I won first place in a state science fair with a solar energy project I had developed alone for months. When I came home with the trophy, expecting pride and celebration, Margaret looked at it and said, "How lovely, dear. Now go wash your hands for dinner. Caroline has important news to share about her piano recital." Caroline's important news was that she had managed to play an entire song without making mistakes, something any 7-year-old should be able to do. But throughout dinner, Margaret talked about Caroline's natural talent and how she was destined for musical greatness, while my trophy was forgotten on the entrance table. At 15, when I received a full scholarship to a summer technology program at MIT, Margaret refused to let me go, saying I needed to spend the summer helping with the family's charity events instead of pursuing these strange masculine hobbies. When I protested, she told me that girls of our social position don't need to work with computers, and that I should focus on developing skills more appropriate for a refined young lady. That same summer, she spent $15,000 sending Caroline to cultural refinement in Paris, where she spent 6 weeks shopping and visiting museums with other daughters of the American elite. The message was crystal clear: my achievements were inconveniences to be managed, while Caroline's most basic accomplishments were evidence of her inherent superiority. 6 months before the family reunion, I had made my last grand gesture, in desperate hope of finally winning Margaret's approval. I used my first bonus as vice president to buy a vintage Mikimoto pearl necklace, identical to the one Margaret's grandmother had worn at her 1952 wedding. It cost $45,000, almost half my annual salary at the time. But I knew Margaret loved vintage jewelry with family history. I spent 3 months searching for the exact piece, working with a specialized antiquarian in Boston who helped me trace the necklace's provenance. When I finally presented it to her on her 58th birthday, in a Tiffany & Co. box with a handwritten letter explaining the piece's history and how it reminded me of Margaret's timeless elegance, I thought I had finally found the key to her heart. Margaret opened the box, examined the necklace for a long moment, and said, "Oh, how thoughtful, Sarah. It's almost as beautiful as the original that belonged to Grandma Hartwell. Of course this is a replica, but it's a very well-made replica." Then she closed the box and changed the subject to the new Range Rover Richard had bought for Caroline. Later, I discovered she told her friends I had given her a cheap imitation of family jewelry because I obviously don't understand the value of authentic pieces. The necklace stayed in her jewelry drawer, never worn, never mentioned again. It was in that moment I realized that no amount of money, effort, or love would ever be enough for this woman, not because I wasn't worthy, but because she was fundamentally incapable of seeing me as anything other than a charity case who should be grateful for basic human decency. The secret that would change everything had come to me by chance. I was cleaning my Palo Alto apartment when I found a stack of old documents I had brought from Connecticut years ago. Among them was my original birth certificate, or at least, what I had always thought was original. Looking at it more closely, I noticed inconsistencies. The paper seemed too new, some information was typed in different fonts, and there was a serial number that didn't match California's pattern for that year. Intrigued, I hired a private investigator who discovered that my birth certificate had been falsified or altered. 2 weeks later, I received a call from a San Francisco law office. A lawyer named David Wong informed me that my biological family had been searching for me for 20 years, and that they had legal documents proving my true identity. Li Wei Chen's first letter arrived 3 days later, written in careful English but filled with love and longing. She explained that my parents, Dr. James Chan and Dr. Susan Liu Chen, were both university professors who died in a car accident when I was 6. Li Wei had fought in courts for 2 years to find me, but the Hartwells had used legal connections to accelerate my adoption and seal all records. For 20 years, my biological grandmother had built a business empire while hiring private investigators to find me. She never gave up. And now, at 89, she desperately wanted to meet me before it was too late. The letter included photos of my parents I had never seen, stories about our family's history, and an invitation to discover who I really was beyond the narrative the Hartwells had constructed around me. The annual Hartwell reunion in Martha's Vineyard was a sacred event that had taken place every Labor Day weekend for more than 15 years. Margaret had inherited a 12-bedroom cottage in Edgartown from a wealthy aunt and transformed this reunion into a family tradition that served as both vacation and opportunity to display a family harmony to friends and acquaintances from high society. This year would be special because Caroline was announcing her second pregnancy and Richard Jr. had just become a junior partner at his father's firm. I spent weeks mentally preparing, knowing this would be my last attempt to find my place in this family before moving on definitively. Li Wei Chen's letter was stored in my jewelry box, along with copies of all the documents the lawyer had sent me. I had decided that, depending on how this weekend unfolded, maybe it was time to tell the truth about my biological family, not out of malice, but because I finally felt strong enough to reclaim my true identity. There was a strange mixture of anxiety and liberation growing inside me, as if I was finally ready to stop begging for a love that might never be available. For the first time in years, I wasn't going to Martha's Vineyard as a supplicant, but as a woman who had built her own life and worth, regardless of the Hartwells' approval. The ocean air felt different as the ferry approached the island. Like it was carrying possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine before. I arrived Friday afternoon on the ferry from Woods Hole, carrying what I secretly knew would be my last grand gesture, a custom photo album containing 20 years of family memories I had carefully compiled over 3 months. Each page had been professionally designed, with rare photos I had digitized from the family's personal archives, accompanied by quotes and poems that captured special moments. The cover was Italian leather engraved with "The Hartwell Legacy, 20 Years of Love and Growth" in gold lettering. It cost $3,000 and countless hours of emotional labor, revisiting decades of memories while selecting each image. When I presented the album to Margaret in the living room, surrounded by Richard, Caroline, and some weekend guests, she flipped through it quickly with a polite but distant smile. "Oh, Sarah, what an interesting project," she said, closing the album without having seen even half the pages. "You've always been good with these creative hobbies. Caroline, show everyone the baby's ultrasound photos." And so, my last gesture of love and inclusion was reduced to a creative hobby and immediately forgotten in favor of the family's real news. But this time, instead of feeling devastated, I felt a strange and liberating clarity. I finally understood that no matter what I did, it would never be enough for this woman, and that understanding was oddly comforting because it freed me from the responsibility of continuing to try. The relief was almost intoxicating, like finally setting down a heavy suitcase I had been carrying for 20 years without realizing how much it was weighing me down. The interactions throughout the weekend revealed the family in their rawest and most honest form. Thomas, perpetually distracted and well-meaning, greeted me with a genuine hug and asked about my work, but when I started explaining my recent promotion, he clearly stopped paying attention after 30 seconds and began talking about his new kite surfing hobby. Richard Jr. was particularly insufferable, apparently intoxicated by his new status as junior partner, making condescending comments about how fun it must be to work in tech, while clearly having no idea what my company did or what level my position was. During Friday dinner, he told an elaborate story about how he had closed a $50 million deal, which, knowing the firm, probably meant he had been an assistant on a case another lawyer had resolved, while Margaret praised him as if he had just cured cancer. Caroline was in full a pregnant princess mode, expecting everyone to take care of her and constantly redirecting conversations to her pregnancy symptoms, her food cravings, and her nursery decoration plans. Jessica arrived Saturday morning, clearly reluctant and armed with a defensive attitude that cut through the air like a knife. She greeted me with silent solidarity, but quickly became involved in a tense argument with Margaret about a family expectations and social responsibilities that ended with Jessica aggressively smoking on the back deck while Margaret muttered about ungrateful daughters loudly enough for everyone to hear. The weekend felt like watching a play where I knew all the actors and lines by heart, but I was finally understanding that I wasn't part of the main cast, I was just an extra who had spent years trying to promote herself to a starring role. That was never available. As the weekend progressed, I began observing the family dynamics with an anthropological clarity I had never experienced before. It was as if I was watching a theater performance where I knew all the actors and dialogue by heart, but finally understood that I wasn't part of the main cast. I was just a background character who had spent years trying to promote herself to a protagonist role that was never available. Sitting on the deck overlooking Vineyard Sound, watching Margaret organize an elaborate lunch for 15 people, including the high society neighbors she loved to impress, I noticed how every interaction with me was a performance for the audience. She included me in conversations just enough to seem like a loving mother, but always in a way that positioned me as the successful adopted daughter, an extension of her own generosity, not a person with her own merit. During lunch, when Mrs. Pemberton, a pretentious neighbor, asked about my work, Margaret answered for me, "Sarah works with computers in California. It's wonderful how she found a career that matches her natural abilities." The implication was clear. I had found my appropriate place as a technical employee, not as a business leader. When I tried to mention my promotion to vice president, Margaret quickly changed the subject to Richard Jr.'s more impressive achievements in the more sophisticated legal world. Every conversation was carefully orchestrated to maintain the hierarchy where the biological children were the stars and Jessica and I were supporting players whose main function was to make Margaret look magnanimous. The small and constant provocations were like drops of water torturing a stone, each one insignificant individually, but devastating together. During Saturday dinner, Margaret told a story about how Caroline had naturally inherited the Hartwell gene for leadership because she was organizing a charity event for her children's school, while I was literally managing 15 offices and hundreds of employees. When Richard casually asked about my love life, Margaret interrupted before I could answer. "Sarah is so focused on her career. Sometimes I worry she won't find time for the really important things in life, like family and relationships." This from a woman who had systematically sabotaged my relationships for years, always finding flaws in any man I brought home. During Sunday breakfast, when Jessica mentioned she was proud of me for finally finding my way, Margaret corrected, "Well, Jessica, Sarah has always had our support. Sometimes it takes time for some people to discover where they belong. But family means never giving up on someone." The message was clear. I was a long-term charity project that had finally paid off, not a woman who had built success through her own talent and determination. Each comment was carefully calibrated to diminish me while elevating the biological children, always delivered with a sweet smile and a tone that made it impossible to protest without seeming ungrateful or paranoid. The cruelest part was how Margaret made these comments sound like compliments or expressions of maternal concern, when they were actually systematic attempts to keep me in my assigned place as the grateful recipient of her benevolence. The turning point happened during the traditional Sunday brunch, when Margaret had invited about 20 neighbors and high society friends for what she called a family celebration. It was always the grand finale of the weekend, where she displayed her perfect family like living trophies of her moral and social superiority. This year, she had planned something special, a speech about the importance of traditional American family values and the power of generous spirit. She positioned herself in the center of the stone patio, overlooking the ocean, wearing a white Ralph Lauren linen dress that cost more than some cars, holding a champagne flute like it was a royal scepter. "Dear friends," she began in her most melodious voice, "Richard and I have always believed that family isn't just about blood, it's about conscious choices to love and elevate those who need guidance." She continued talking about how they had opened their hearts and their home to two girls who weren't fortunate enough to be born into favorable circumstances. As she spoke, her eyes met mine with a triumphant gleam that made me understand this speech was directed specifically at me. Today, we're proud to see how our Caroline is building her own beautiful family, how our Richard Jr. is continuing the family tradition of legal excellence, and how our Thomas is discovering his passion for life. A dramatic pause. And of course, we see how our adopted girls have found their own paths, Jessica with her creative art in Brooklyn, and Sarah with her technical work in California. It's gratifying to see how love and family structure can transform lives that could have taken very different directions. The applause that followed felt like nails on a chalkboard. Each clap a validation of Margaret's narrative that positioned me as a rescue project rather than an accomplished professional who had earned her success through merit and hard work. The blood rushed to my head as I processed what had just happened. In a single sentence, Margaret had reduced me to technical work in front of all of Martha's Vineyard's social elite, while elevating the biological children as heirs to a family dynasty. She had transformed my executive career into something equivalent to computer repair, as if I were a successful IT technician who should be grateful for having learned a useful skill. Worse still, she had done this deliberately, knowing exactly the impact of her words, with that sweet smile she used when she wanted to appear maternal while emotionally destroying someone. I looked around and saw the faces of the audience. Some clearly embarrassed by the condescending tone, others nodding approval at this inspiring story of family charity. Mrs. Pemberton even murmured, "What a lovely story," to the woman beside her. Caroline was radiant, clearly loving being positioned as the true family heiress, while Richard Jr. had that smug smile that appeared whenever he felt superior. Thomas looked uncomfortable but not surprised, as if this type of public humiliation were just another typical Hartwell Sunday. Jessica was clearly furious, her fists clenched at her sides, but I knew that if she exploded now, she'd be labeled as the problematic daughter having another dramatic episode. It was in that moment I felt something inside me break definitively. Not from pain, but from liberation. I finally understood that Margaret was never going to change, that I could become CEO of Apple and she would still introduce me as a Sarah who works with computers. The clarity was almost euphoric, like finally understanding the rules of a game I had been losing for 20 years because I didn't realize I was playing by the wrong rulebook. The decision to break the silence wasn't impulsive, it was the result of 20 years of emotional calculations finally reaching their logical conclusion. While Margaret continued her speech about second chances and the power of unconditional love, I calmly stood up from the table and walked to my purse, which was on the side table of the patio. I took out a leather folder I had brought just in case. Inside were copies of Li Wei-Chen's letter, documents from the private investigator, and my real birth certificate. My heart was beating hard, but my mind was crystal clear. I wasn't doing this for revenge or drama, I was doing this because I finally felt strong enough to reclaim my true story. I returned to my place at the table but remained standing, waiting for Margaret to finish her performance. When she finally concluded with "To family love that transcends all barriers," and the audience began to politely applaud, I cleared my throat and said in a loud, clear voice, "What a beautiful story, Margaret. But there are some important details you left out." The patio fell into complete silence. Margaret turned to me with that frozen smile she used when she was about to publicly crush me for interrupting or being inappropriate. But this time, I was prepared. For example, I continued, keeping my voice calm but firm, "You forgot to mention that my biological family never stopped looking for me. And that you knew about it." The champagne flute in Margaret's hand began to tremble almost imperceptibly. And I could see the first cracks appearing in her carefully constructed facade. The moment of revelation was like breaking a dam that had been accumulating pressure for decades. I held Li Wei-Chen's letter high, her elegant handwriting clearly visible to everyone, and began reading aloud, "My dear granddaughter Sarah, I am Li Wei-Chen, your paternal grandmother. Your grandfather and I never stopped looking for you since the day you disappeared from the system after your parents' death." As I read, I could see Margaret's face changing from confusion to horror and then to pure panic. She tried to interrupt me twice, "Sarah, this isn't the appropriate time," but I continued reading about how my grandmother had built a multi-million-dollar company while hiring private investigators, how she had discovered the Hartwells, had used legal connections to accelerate my adoption and seal records, and how she desperately wanted to meet me before it was too late. When I finished reading the letter, the silence on the patio was deafening. Then I showed the investigators documents proving the alterations to my birth certificate and my biological family's legal attempts to find me. "So, to be clear," I said, looking directly at Margaret, "I wasn't saved from bad circumstances. I was separated from a family who loved me and never stopped searching for me. And you knew about it all along." Mrs. Pemberton's face was pale, other guests were whispering among themselves, and Caroline looked like she was going to vomit, but not from morning sickness. The sound of the ocean waves suddenly seemed incredibly loud, as if nature itself was trying to fill the stunned silence that had fallen over Margaret's carefully orchestrated celebration. My exit was planned for maximum impact and personal dignity. I calmly folded Li Wei Chen's letter and placed it back in the folder, along with all the documents. Then I picked up the photo album I had made as my last grand gesture, that $3,000 project Margaret had dismissed as a creative hobby, and held it against my chest. "I'll be taking this with me," I said calmly, since apparently I need to learn about my real family history. I walked over to where Margaret was standing, still holding her champagne flute like it was a shield, and said in a low voice, but audible to everyone, "Thank you for the 20 years of housing. Consider any debt of gratitude completely paid." Then I turned to the embarrassed guests and said with a genuine smile, "I apologize for interrupting this lovely event. I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday." As I walked toward the house to get my suitcase, I could hear Jessica following me, whispering, "Sarah, wait." But I didn't stop. For the first time in 20 years, I was leaving a family gathering on my own terms, as a woman who knew her own worth, not as a child begging for crumbs of approval. In my Uber on the way to the ferry, my phone was already ringing incessantly. But I put it on silent mode. It was time to discover who I really was, away from the people who had spent 2 decades telling me who I should be. The ferry ride back to the mainland felt like crossing more than just water. It felt like traveling from one life to another, from a world where I was always apologizing for existing to one where I might finally be celebrated for who I actually was. Margaret's reaction was a public collapse that no amount of New England social education could disguise. After I left, Jessica told me later that Margaret stood in the middle of the patio for several minutes, holding her champagne flute. With trembling hands, muttering, "This can't be happening," repeatedly. When Mrs. Pemberton gently asked if she was okay, Margaret exploded into a rant about ungrateful daughters, and how she had sacrificed so much only to be betrayed. Richard tried to guide the guests inside the house, mumbling embarrassed apologies, but the damage was done. Margaret had spent years carefully constructing an image of herself as a secular saint, a woman who was so above average that she could afford to elevate the less fortunate through her benevolence. In 5 minutes, that image had been destroyed in front of the people whose opinion she valued most. Not only had she been exposed as someone who had kept a family separated for 2 decades, but she had been publicly rejected by the very person she used as evidence of her moral superiority. For a woman like Margaret, whose entire identity was built on control and appearances, this wasn't just humiliation, it was existential annihilation. Jessica said Margaret spent the rest of the day locked in her room, refusing to come out even when guests began leaving early, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama they had witnessed. The annual Hartwell reunion, which for 15 years had been Margaret's social event of the summer, had become the weekend when her carefully cultivated reputation was destroyed by the adopted daughter she had underestimated for so long. The irony was perfect. In trying to use me as a prop in her performance of moral superiority, Margaret had given me the exact platform I needed to expose the truth about who she really was underneath all that designer clothing and philanthropic posturing. Topic 5. Consequences and resolution. In the first 48 hours after my dramatic exit from Martha's Vineyard, my phone became an epicenter of emotional chaos. Richard called me 6 times, leaving increasingly desperate messages progressing from, "Sarah, we need to talk about this misunderstanding," to, "Please, you're destroying this family." Caroline sent me a sequence of texts that started with, "How can you do this to Mom when she's pregnant?" and escalated to, "You were always jealous, and now you're being cruel." Surprisingly, Thomas sent me a single long message at 2 a.m. "I know we never talked much, but I always knew you guys were treated differently. I don't think you're wrong. Sorry I never said anything." Margaret didn't contact me directly, but Jessica told me she was calling all the extended family members, trying to control the narrative, describing me as emotionally disturbed and influenced by scammers who are trying to take advantage of her. Ironically, she was using the same emotional manipulation tactics she had used for years to control me, but now I had enough distance to recognize the patterns. The most unexpected message came from Mrs. Pemberton, the pretentious neighbor from Martha's Vineyard, who sent me a formal email, Dear Sarah, as a mother and grandmother, I want you to know that your speech was courageous and necessary. Some of us noticed the unequal treatment over the years, but didn't feel it was our place to speak. I wish you all the best in your journey to reconnect with your true family. It was surreal to realize that strangers had observed dynamics I had thought were too subtle to be detected. The validation from an outsider who had no reason to lie was oddly healing. It confirmed that I hadn't been paranoid or oversensitive all these years. The conversation that changed everything happened Tuesday night, when Jessica showed up at my Palo Alto door unannounced, having driven straight from the airport, carrying a bottle of wine and a determined expression I hadn't seen in years. We need to talk, she said, and not over the phone where Margaret might be listening. Sitting in my living room, Jessica told me truths about our childhood that she had kept for years, afraid I couldn't handle it. She told me that Margaret used to talk about me differently when I wasn't around, always with a tone of condescending ownership. Our Sarah is so ambitious. But sometimes she forgets where she came from. Jessica also revealed that Margaret had intercepted at least 2 contact attempts from my biological family over the years. Once when I was in college, a private investigator had called the house, and Margaret had lied, saying I had moved without leaving an address. I heard the conversation, Jessica confessed, and at the time I thought Margaret was protecting us from some kind of scam. But now I realize she was protecting her narrative of control. The most painful revelation was that my own biological siblings had questioned Margaret about why she treated Jessica and me differently, but she always explained it as personality differences and individual needs, convincing them it was well-intentioned parenting strategy. Jessica cried when she told me, I should have defended you more. I should have realized it wasn't normal. But Margaret was so good at making everything seem reasonable, at making any resistance seem like ingratitude or drama. That night, as we finished the bottle of wine and talked until dawn, I realized that Jessica had been as much a victim of Margaret's manipulation as I had. She had just been assigned a different role in the family drama. My first call to Li Wei Chen was one of the most surreal and emotional experiences of my life. Using the number the lawyer had provided, I called a house in Pacific Heights at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, my heart beating so hard I could barely hold the phone. An elderly female voice answered in English with a slight accent, "Hello?" When I said, "Hello, I'm looking for Li Wei Chen, my name is Sarah," there was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard the sound of someone crying softly and the voice trembling, "Sarah? My Sarah? Oh, my God, I prayed for this day for 20 years. We talked for 3 hours in that first call, Li Wei telling me about my parents, how my father was a physics professor at UC Berkeley and my mother taught comparative literature, how they met in a Chinatown cafe and were deeply passionate about education and building bridges between cultures. She described how I was at 6 years old, always asking questions, always building things with blocks, always trying to understand how everything worked. Li Wei told me about the company she had built, Chen Import International, which started with her selling authentic Chinese tea from a small Chinatown shop and grew to become one of the largest Asian product importers on the West Coast. I built all of this while looking for you, she told me. Every contract I signed, every employee I hired, every decision I made, I thought, one day my granddaughter will see what I built for her. At the end of the call, she invited me to dinner that weekend, and I knew my life was about to change completely again. The difference in her voice when she said my name, like it was precious, like it belonged to someone she had been missing desperately, was so different from how Margaret said it, with that slight edge of ownership and disappointment. The contrast between Li Wei Chen and Margaret Hartwell was like comparing the sun to an artificial lamp. When I arrived at Li Wei's house in Pacific Heights, an elegant 3-story Victorian with stunning bay views, I was greeted not just by my grandmother, but by 15 family members who had flown from across the country to meet me. Cousins I didn't know existed, aunts and uncles who had kept childhood photos of me for 2 decades, an entire family that had metaphorically kept my place at the table during all those years. Li Wei, a small but imposing 89-year-old woman with bright eyes and a smile that radiated genuine warmth, hugged me for 5 full minutes at the front door, whispering in Chinese and English alternately. During dinner, a traditional Chinese feast with 12 dishes she had spent days preparing, I learned I had 2 cousins who were doctors, an aunt who was a university professor, an uncle who ran a tech company, and an entire family that valued education, hard work, and personal achievement not as signs of social status, but as expressions of human potential. When I told them about my promotion to vice president, the entire table applauded, not with polite education, but with genuine and explosive pride. Li Wei held my hand and said, "Your parents would be so proud. They always knew you would do extraordinary things." For the first time in my life, I felt my achievements were celebrated for what they really were, not diminished or recontextualized to serve someone else's agenda. The warmth in that dining room was so different from the cold performance of Hartwell family dinners. Here, love wasn't conditional on perfection, success wasn't measured against other people's achievements, and belonging wasn't something I had to earn through constant gratitude and self-improvement. My healing journey began with intensive therapy, but also with the gradual discovery of who I really was when I wasn't constantly defending myself or trying to prove my worth. I started working with a therapist who specialized in adoption trauma and toxic family dynamics, Dr. Emily Liu, an ironic coincidence that she shared my original surname. Through weekly sessions, I began to unravel decades of conditioning that had taught me love was something that needed to be earned through perfect performance, instead of something that should be given unconditionally. Dr. Liu helped me understand that my hypercompetence at work, my need to be indispensable and perfect, was a direct response to years of being treated as if my value were conditional. Parallel to therapy, I began exploring my Chinese heritage in ways Margaret had systematically blocked for years. Li Wei enrolled me in Mandarin classes, at 28, finally learning the language Margaret had told me didn't matter anymore. Taught me to cook traditional dishes my parents used to make when I was little, and introduced me to aspects of Chinese American culture that were complex, proud, and completely different from the superficial and exoticized version I had internalized. More importantly, I began building relationships based on mutual authenticity instead of desperate approval. Li Wei never tried to reform me or tell me who I should be. She delighted in discovering who I already was and celebrated every aspect of my personality as if they were precious gifts she had waited decades to unwrap. The unconditional acceptance was almost overwhelming at first. I kept waiting for the conditions, the expectations, the subtle criticisms that would let me know what I needed to change to be worthy of love. The fate of the photo album became a poetic symbol of my transformation. 4 weeks after Martha's Vineyard, it sat on my coffee table, a painful reminder of how much emotional effort I had invested in one-sided relationships. But then Li Wei saw it during one of her visits and asked to examine it. She spent hours studying each page, not for the photos of the Hartwells, but for the images of me throughout the years, graduations, birthdays, vacations, moments she had missed but could now witness through my careful curation work. "You documented your own life," she said softly, "even when you felt invisible." We decided to transform the album into something new. We removed the Hartwell photos and replaced them with images of my Chen family, creating a visual narrative that honored both my past and my future. Li Wei contributed photos of my parents, our extended family, and the company she had built, a company that, she revealed on the last day of the project, she wanted me to consider running someday. Chen Import International was always your inheritance, she told me. I built it for you, even when I didn't know where you were. The reformed album became not a monument to unrequited love, but a celebration of resilience and identity discovery. It was sitting on my new home's coffee table when I received the call that would change everything once more. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same creative energy I had poured into trying to document my place in the Hartwell family had become the foundation for understanding my place in my real family. The unexpected twist came 6 weeks after Martha's Vineyard, in the form of a call from Richard Sr. at 7 a.m. on a Thursday. His voice was tense and formal. "Sarah, I know you don't want to talk to us right now, but I need to tell you something important. Margaret is in the hospital." My first instinct was genuine concern, but Richard quickly clarified, "She's not sick. She's had what doctors are calling a complete nervous breakdown. It started 3 days after Martha's Vineyard and progressively got worse. He told me that Margaret had become obsessed with fixing the situation, hiring 3 different private investigators to prove that Li Wei-chan was a scammer. Calling lawyers about suing for parental alienation, and spending days without sleep creating elaborate strategies to recover her social reputation. The breaking point came when she discovered, through an investigator she had hired, that Chen Import International wasn't just a real company, but one of the most respected in its sector, and that Li Wei-chan was known in business circles as one of the most successful immigrant entrepreneurs in California. She realized, Richard said tiredly, that you didn't just find your biological family, but that they are, well, more successful and respected than we are. The irony was devastating. Margaret had spent 20 years trying to convince me I should be grateful for being elevated from inferior origins, only to discover that my origins were, by any metric she valued, superior to hers. It wasn't just that she had lost control of the narrative, it was that the entire narrative was the opposite of what she had believed and propagated for 2 decades. The woman who had positioned herself as my savior had actually been the obstacle standing between me and a family that was everything she pretended to be: successful, respected, genuinely generous, and authentically loving. Looking back now, 3 months after that life-changing weekend in Martha's Vineyard, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about family dynamics or even finding my biological roots, it was about learning to trust my own perception of reality. For 20 years, I had been gaslit into believing that my feelings of inadequacy and displacement were character flaws I needed to overcome, rather than natural responses to an unnatural situation. The therapy sessions with Dr. Liu helped me understand that when you grow up in an environment where love is conditional and your worth is constantly questioned, you develop hypervigilance that can actually be a superpower once you learn to trust it. My instincts about Margaret's manipulation weren't paranoia, they were accurate assessments of someone who was fundamentally incapable of unconditional love. Learning to honor my own emotional truth, instead of constantly second-guessing myself to accommodate other people's comfort, has been the most liberating experience of my adult life. I've also learned that authentic success isn't about proving yourself to people who will never see your worth, it's about building a life that reflects your values and surrounding yourself with people who celebrate your authentic self. The business skills I developed while desperately trying to win Margaret's approval have served me well, but now I use them to build something meaningful rather than to chase validation from people who are never going to give it. Li Wei often tells me that my parents would be proud not just of what I've accomplished, but of how I've learned to stand up for myself with dignity and grace. Strength without kindness is just bullying, she says, but kindness without strength is just enabling. You've learned to have both. The ripple effects of that Sunday brunch confrontation continue to unfold in ways I never anticipated. Margaret's nervous breakdown became a kind of reckoning for the entire Hartwell family system. Richard Sr. reached out last month to tell me that they're all in family therapy now, something Margaret had resisted for decades, claiming their family was too healthy to need professional help. Caroline apologized through a carefully worded letter, admitting that she had always known something wasn't right, but had been too afraid of losing her privileged position to speak up. Even Richard Jr., in his own awkward way, sent a LinkedIn message acknowledging that he had misunderstood my professional accomplishments and asking if I might consider hiring his firm for some of Chen Import International's legal work. The irony of him trying to benefit from the very success he had dismissed for years wasn't lost on me, but I appreciated the gesture as a sign that people can grow when their old systems no longer serve them. Jessica and I have grown closer than ever. She's planning to move to San Francisco next year, partly to be near me and partly to explore opportunities in the thriving arts scene here. We've both started learning Mandarin together, and Li Wei has basically adopted Jessica as an honorary granddaughter, understanding that chosen family is just as valuable as biological family. Thomas, surprisingly, has been the most consistently supportive of the biological siblings, texting me regularly and even visiting during a trip to California. He told me that watching me stand up to Margaret gave him permission to start questioning family dynamics he had always accepted as normal. 6 weeks ago, Li Wei officially asked me to consider taking over Chen Import International as CEO within the next 2 years. The company she built while searching for me has grown into a $200 million operation with partnerships across Asia and distribution networks throughout North America. I didn't build this company for money, she told me. during a formal dinner where she presented me with the business plan. I built it as a bridge between our culture and this country, between the past and the future, and most importantly, as a bridge back to you. The thought of running a company that was literally built as an act of love feels overwhelming. And perfect at the same time. Li Wei wants to spend her remaining years teaching me not just about business, but about our family history, our cultural traditions, and the values that have sustained our family through decades of separation. She's also made it clear that part of my inheritance comes with responsibility, using our resources to help other families who have been separated by systemic barriers, and creating opportunities for young Asian Americans who might be struggling with identity and belonging the way I did. The foundation we're planning to establish will focus on family reunification services and cultural identity support for adoptees and immigrants. It feels like turning my pain into purpose, and my individual healing into collective healing. For the first time in my life, I'm not just trying to prove I deserve a seat at the table, I'm helping to build a bigger table where more people can belong. The most unexpected gift in all of this has been learning that my biological parents' love story wasn't ended by their death, it was continued through the family they left behind and the daughter they raised for 6 beautiful years. Li Wei has hours of home videos I had never seen, showing my parents reading to me in both English and Mandarin, teaching me to cook dumplings, and playing elaborate make-believe games where I was always the hero of the story. Watching those videos, I could see where my love of learning came from, my instinct to build and create, and my natural confidence that got buried under years of conditional acceptance. My parents didn't just love me, they delighted in me, the same way Li Wei does now. Understanding that I was genuinely cherished for 6 years, before I was taught to question my worth, has been profoundly healing. It explains why I never fully believed Margaret's narrative about being lucky to be rescued. Some part of me remembered what real love felt like, even when I couldn't articulate it. Dr. Liu calls this embodied memory, the way our nervous systems remember safety and love even when our conscious minds have forgotten. The little girl who won science fairs and asked endless questions wasn't trying to earn love, she was expressing the confidence that comes from being unconditionally loved. That little girl is still inside me, and now she has permission to be curious, ambitious, and unapologetically herself without having to justify her existence to anyone. Today, I live in a beautiful Pacific Heights apartment just 6 blocks from Li Wei's house, where Sunday dinners are loud, chaotic affairs with rotating cast of cousins, business partners, and honorary family members who Li Wei has collected over the decades. My walls are covered with photos of my real family, artwork from Jessica's latest exhibition, and the business awards I've won since taking on more responsibility at Chin Import International. The contrast with the sterile perfection of the Hartwell Mansion is striking. My home feels alive, lived in, and unapologetically personal. I keep Margaret's pearl necklace in my jewelry box, not as a reminder of rejection, but as a reminder of how far I've traveled from the woman who thought she needed to spend $45,000 to buy love. Sometimes I think about wearing it to important business meetings, not because it's beautiful, but because it reminds me that my value was never determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Li Wei laughs when I tell her about the necklace, saying it's very American to spend so much money on something that doesn't make you happy. In China, she says, we have a saying, a jade stone is still valuable even if no one recognizes it as jade. You were always precious, Sarah. Margaret's blindness was never about your worth, it was about her own limitations. That wisdom, simple as it sounds, has become the foundation of how I navigate all my relationships now. I don't waste energy trying to convince people to see my value, I invest in relationships with people who already recognize it. As I finish recording this story, I want to leave you with the most important truth I've learned: you are not responsible for other people's inability to love you properly. If you're living in a family system where your worth is constantly questioned, where your achievements are diminished, where your authentic self is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be celebrated, the issue is not with you. It's never been with you. You don't need to be perfect to deserve love, you don't need to be grateful for the basic human decency that should be freely given, and you don't need to spend your life proving you're worthy of a seat at tables where you're not genuinely welcomed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop begging for crumbs from people who should be offering you a feast, and go find your real family, whether that's biological family, chosen family, or the family you create through meaningful work and authentic relationships. Your story doesn't end with other people's inability to see your worth, it begins when you stop letting their blindness determine your value. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like a stranger in your own family or questioned whether you're asking for too much when you ask to be treated with basic respect and love, please know that you're not alone and you're not wrong. Trust your instincts, honor your truth, and never stop looking for the people who will celebrate exactly who you are. If this story hit home for you, leave a comment below about how you've redefined family in your own life or taken a stand for your authentic self. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories about finding your true identity and healing from family trauma, and share this with someone who needs to hear that they deserve unconditional love just as they are. Remember, the people who are meant to be in your life will never make you feel like you're too much or not enough, they'll make you feel like you're exactly right, exactly as you are, exactly when you need them most.